Good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be with you at the beginning of this Haslemere Festival. War artists first came to prominence in this country during the First World War. As we just ended commemorating the centenary of that war, I'll say just a little about the First World War artists as a lead-in to my talk about the Second World War. It may not have escaped your notice that the 3rd of September this year will be the 80th anniversary of the start of the Second World War, and also the 6th of June will be the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the beginning of the end, you might say. So my talk today does seem to be rather appropriate. The poet Stephen Spencer, reflecting on that great war, wrote, "Art would have meant pictures of the Western Front, blasted trees, trenches, mud, shell holes, shattered Ypres, the straight roads of France with army lorries moving through a landscape of bursting shells, a landscape where no birds sang." That war certainly created opportunities for many artists, some of whom had served as combatant soldiers at the front. And you may be familiar with some of these, such as that one by John Nash, Over the Top, very well-known painting. And then there was Christopher Nevinson, who did that work in the trenches. And we had Stanley Spencer. I'll say more about Stanley Spencer later on. And this work was coupled with work of already established artists such as John Singer Sargent, very well-known painting, aftermath of mustard gas attack, soldiers walking towards the dressing station. Well, World War II was fought under a very different scenario. There were no trenches, with artists and photographers recording gallant soldiers going over the top. Instead, we had such epic events as Dunkirk and D-Day landings, the Middle East and Italian campaigns, plus the war in the air and at sea, and the devastating effects on the home front, scenes that just weren't applicable in the First World War, completely different scenario. Well, it was 1917, while that First World War was still going on, that a young boy aged 14 was taken to an exhibition of war artists at the Royal Academy. And this had a very significant and long-lasting impact on him. That young boy was to become an eminent historian, and his name was Kenneth Clark. We all remember him for his excellent Civilization series, which was televised in the late 1960s. In 1933, Kenneth Clark had been appointed the youngest director of the National Gallery at the age of 30. He was surveyor of the King's Pictures in 1934, and he was knighted in 1938. At the beginning of the Second World War, the Ministry of Information, prompted by Sir Kenneth Clark, established the War Artists Advisory Committee. Clark chaired the committee throughout the war. Its brief was to draw up a list of artists qualified to record the war at home and abroad, in cooperation with the services departments and other government departments, to advise on the selection of artists on this list for war purposes and on the arrangements for their employment. The War Artists Committee held their first meeting at the National Gallery in November 1939, and they continued meeting once a month throughout the war. Serving on the committee were representatives of the Imperial War Museum, Royal College of Art, Royal Academy of Schools, as well as all three armed services. The purpose of the War Artists scheme officially was to raise morale and promote Britain's image abroad. War Artists exhibitions were held in this country, in America, and all the main Commonwealth countries for that purpose. But Kenneth Clark's generation had been marked by deaths of many artists and writers in the First World War, and he hoped that by keeping artists usefully employed, the scheme might prevent a new generation of British artists from being killed. He was anxious that their talents should be fully recognised and used, rather than their being subjected to indiscriminate wartime call-up. Despite these efforts, 3 artists were actually killed during the Second World War, and I'll be saying more about them during the talk. In the early years of the war, the artists would be mainly working on the home front. And then from 1942, artists were sent to theatres of war in North Africa, Europe and the Far East, where they went through the same extremes as soldiers, from tedium to tension, equatorial sun and freezing winters, and all that gave the Second World War collection an unparalleled range and variety. The project employed most of the leading artists of the day and many other up-and-coming artists who were to make names for themselves. At the outbreak of war, both Henry Moore and Graham Sutherland were teaching at Chelsea School of Art. The school closed and they lost their teaching posts. Henry Moore decided to occupy himself with drawing instead, and he took over studios in Hampstead that had belonged to Barbara Hepworth and her husband Ben Nicholson, who, like many others, left London during the war. Well, one evening, travelling on the Underground, Moore noticed crowds of people at each station lying all over the platforms, and when he got out at Belsize Park, he too was confined to the tube station because of bombing above. Well, inspired by rows of reclining figures and the grim tension, Moore took notes and sketched scenes of swaddled forms as if they were in a burial tomb. He returned again and again to the Underground during bombing raids, producing black and white drawings of figures lying down, hunched and sitting in intimate and ad hoc groups. All the people are faceless. No detail or expression is needed to sense the cramped and airless situation of these Londoners, all waiting blindly to see what fate their city has met while they look at the long tiled walls of their shelter. Here's another one. 4 Grey Sleepers. Well, these drawings helped to boost Moore's international reputation, particularly in America, where examples were included in a famous exhibition, or one that became famous, called Britain at War, which toured North America right throughout the war. Moving on to Graham Sutherland, most of us probably remember him best for his post-war paintings, such as that one, described as the great man as a remarkable example of modern art. His wife wasn't so flattering, and eventually she had that painting destroyed. Well, Graham Sutherland had moved to Gloucestershire when the Chelsea School of Art closed. He was a good friend of Kenneth Clark, and so, not surprisingly, he was contacted in 1940 by the committee, and he agreed to take on a commission as war artist. And this was to be the start of a fruitful wartime career. In more than 150 works, Sutherland covered bomb damage in South Wales and London, tin mining in Cornwall, V2 rocket sites, and later on railway sites bombed by the RAF in France. And here's a typical example of the London bomb damage. These bomb-damaged buildings were in an area just north of St Paul's, and they're amongst some of the most painful and grotesque images produced on the home front during the war. Gradually, as Sutherland began to identify the key elements from the mess of desolation, he would begin to isolate form. You see there, for instance, a lift shaft, the only thing left from what had obviously been a very tall building, bizarrely collapsed, as he said, quote, like a wounded tiger in a painting by Delacroix. He described it as an eerie, foul-smelling, deserted wasteland, which he explored with growing confidence during the Blitz, though occasionally buildings would collapse around him. And here's another example of 3 years later, devastation in the East End. The theme of most of Sutherland's wartime paintings was the massive devastation caused by bombing raids. John Piper, at the start of World War II, he was persuaded by Kenneth Clark to work as an official war artist. Piper accepted, and he persuaded the committee that he should be allowed to concentrate on painting bombed churches. This may have reflected both his pre-war conversion to the Anglican faith as much as his previous interest in depicting derelict architectural ruins. The terms of this commission meant that Piper would be visiting bombed cities and other sites as soon as possible following an air raid, offering often, as he said, the following morning before the clearing up. Hence he arrived in Coventry the morning after the Coventry air raid in November 1940, and that had resulted in 1,000 casualties and the destruction of the medieval cathedral. There we see it. He made drawings of the cathedral and other gutted churches in the city, which he subsequently worked up into oil paintings in his studio. His first painting of the bombed cathedral, the interior of Coventry Cathedral, was described by Geoffrey Daniels, art critic in the Times, as all the more poignant for the exclusion of a human element. The emptiness of the destroyed buildings gives a sense of human loss. Piper was too young to have served in the First World War, but his elder brother had been killed at Ypres, and this must have had an emotional effect on his artwork. After the war, both Piper and Sutherland did tapestries for Coventry Cathedral. Stanley Spencer, who you saw briefly in the First World War, was one of the few artists who served in both World Wars. That's a self-portrait, by the way, which was painted at his home in Cookham. In the First World War, he was a medical orderly and later in an infantry regiment. And he was invalided out with malaria in 1980. It was only then that he was appointed a war artist and giving rise to the paintings like the one you saw in Macedonia, and also the post-war collection at Sandham Memorial Chapel that I'm sure many of you have seen. In World War II, the committee snapped him up and sent him to the Lithgow's shipyard in Port Glasgow on the River Clyde to depict civilians at work there. Merchant shipping was suffering terrible losses, threatening the supply of materials from America, and in asking Spencer to paint events at Lithgow's shipyard, the committee was looking to support the important work going on there. Well, Spencer was fascinated by skills and trades of the industry rather than the boats themselves. And he devoted himself to producing a large series of 11 paintings entitled Shipbuilding on the Clyde. Well, the one you see there was the centrepiece of the series. It depicts how the workforce draws out the hot metal with instinctive teamwork before shaping it on the workshop floor. The complete series of 11 is now stored in the Imperial War Museum. And a few years ago, Sir Alex Ferguson, who once worked in the Glasgow shipyards with other members of his family, led a campaign for restoration of all those paintings. And I'm glad to say that restoration was successfully completed in 2010. I come now to Frank Dobson. Now, he's seen as one of the most important British sculptors of the 20th century, as well as being a painter, and that's a self-portrait sculpture. But the committee were more interested in paintings, and they commissioned several of Dobson's paintings, including this very unusual subject, Escalator in an Underground Factory. What you see there, at the height of the Blitz, the Plessy Company, who had vital experience in radio and aircraft electronic equipment, took over a 2-mile section of the London Underground, would you believe, in order to maintain production. There were 2,000 Plessy workers, and they had to use the stairs and escalators at the stations to access the tunnel system. That picture promotes effectively the value of women workers during the war and the strength of purpose and spirit they showed. So there you are, a very unusual picture. Now, Laura Knight. She was one of the few women artists employed as a war artist. In her long career, she was among the most successful and popular painters in Britain. In 1929, she'd been created Dame, and in 1936, she became the first woman to be elected a Royal Academician since the foundation of that establishment way back in 1768. Well, in the autumn of 1942, she was commissioned by the committee to paint a portrait to bolster female recruitment to the ordnance factories, as the Ministry of Supply were concerned at the level of absenteeism among women in the factories. The resulting painting, which you see there, is one of the largest oil paintings in the entire collection and the largest single figure portrait acquired during the war. I've no idea who Ruby Loftus was, but the painting was first shown in April 1943 at the Royal Academy, and the next day it was reproduced in 8 British newspapers. The painting, along with Laura Knight and Ruby Loftus, also featured in the British Paramount film show, news film, shown in cinemas, and it's reproduced in a poster version by the committee. Well, the success of that painting led to further industrial commissions for Laura Knight throughout the 1940s. You see here a team of WAFs hoisting a barrage balloon into position. You can just see in the background the chimneys of industrial Coventry surrounding the spire of Coventry Cathedral. The committee commissioned the work as a propaganda tool to recruit women for balloon command, and Laura Knight's composition succeeds in making the work appear both heroic and glamorous. After the war, Laura Knight was appointed official war artist at the Nuremberg trials at the age of 70 and at her own request. Now I'm coming on to Edward Ardisoni. He was of the official war artists being described as Joker in the pack. Prior to the war, he was known for his rather bibulous watercolours of bars, cafes and street life, as well as illustrating children's books. And given this, he seemed refreshingly untypical as a war artist. Here's one example. Priest begging a lift in Louvain in 1940. A portly priest, looking rather more comical than desperate. Ardisoni produced hundreds of drawings of watercolours, largely done in great haste and difficult conditions. He worked in France, North Africa, Italy, as well as England. He managed more than anyone to capture the comic side of every situation. He retained this intimate, almost caricaturist style in much of his work, rather than evoking the tedium or tragedy. After the Blitz in 1941, he was sketching bomb damage in the East End when the Home Guard became suspicious and they decided to arrest him as a suspect spy. But he seems to have struck up a good relationship with Captain Mannering, because he was then released, and he also then achieved another painting of the Home Guard itself. You see it there, War in Maida Vale, life in the old dogs yet. I don't know if you noticed it, but by that tree, the figure resembles, to my way of thinking, Private Data Fraser, the dour Private Fraser in Dad's Army. It's played by John Laurie. And I dismissed that at first as an extraordinary coincidence, but I then found an interesting follow-up, because I was reading an army magazine which had an article about it in the part played during the war by various celebrities, musicians, politicians, writers, artists, actors and entertainers. And I'm just going to digress by reading you what it says about Dad's Army. Paints a spectacular picture of military ineptitude, but many of the cast had distinguished war records. John Laurie, the dour Fraser, served in the HAC during the First World War, and the Home Guard in the Second. Now, we'll never know whether that was Private Fraser, but another clue, of course, it was War in Maida Vale, and Maida Vale had the BBC studios there, so I am of the opinion that it could have been John Laurie. But just to continue about the various other people in Dad's Army, Arnold Ridley, who played a Gentle Godfrey, served as an officer in the Somerset Light Infantry, surviving a serious bayonet wound at the Somme in 1916, and he served again with the BEF in the early days of World War II, eventually being evacuated on the last boat home from Boulogne, after which he was medically discharged, and he also joined the Home Guard. Clive Dunn, Corporal Jones, joined the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in 1940, and he was captured in Greece, remaining a POW for 4 years. Arthur Lowe, Captain Mannering, was a radar technician in Remy, and he rose to the rank of sergeant, while John Le Mesurier, the laid-back Sergeant Wilson, was a captain in the Royal Armoured Corps, serving in India. So a bit of role reversal for you there. So anyway, that's the end of that digression. I then come on to the next war artist, and I'm showing you both there, Richard Urick and Charles Cundall, for a rather intriguing reason. It involves painting of the Dunkirk evacuation. The committee were looking for large panoramic reconstructions of the evacuation in 1940. Edward Arzoni, some of whose work you've just been talking about, had actually been with the British Expeditionary Force when it withdrew from Dunkirk, but the works he produced were small-scale representations of events in the immediate surroundings. On the other hand, Richard Urick and Charles Cundall were not there, but they knew the area, and they were prepared to use published accounts, photographs, eyewitness reports, and their own imaginations. And so the committee took on the gamble of commissioning both of these to do this war artist painting of Dunkirk. The two paintings were showed by side at the National Gallery in 1940. And here's the first one. That's the Richard Urick one. I'll show you the second one before I say anything further about them. That's the Charles Cundall one. I'll show you now both together. Newspaper art critics and Kenneth Clark preferred Urick's symmetrical, more classical composition, and they criticised Cundall for having put too much unresolved detail into his picture. The Royal Navy reproduced Urick's painting on its official 1940 Christmas card, and his original was bought by none other than Vincent Massey, who was the Canadian High Commissioner in the UK and was to be the future Governor-General of Canada. On the other hand, Cundall's painting had its merits. Many newspapers produced a Ministry of Information photograph showing two servicemen at the National Gallery exhibition, recognising elements of Cundall's composition. And all 70 crew members of the paddle steamer Royal Eagle that took part in the evacuation wanted copies of Cundall's painting. Now, whenever I give this talk, I always ask the audience to let me know which one they prefer. So could we have a show of hands for the Cundall, for the Urick one first? A few. The Cundall one? Yes, well that's very interesting because I must say that every talk I've given, Cundall has always been the one who's been preferred. And I think probably you can see why, although I have to say Urick did go on to paint a lot of other very important paintings for the committee. Just to continue with Cundall, that was the return of HMS Exeter. One of the very first naval battles took place in December 1939. 4 ships from the Royal Navy took part in the Battle of the River Plate, Montevideo, when the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee was holed up and subsequently was scuttled by its captain. HMS Exeter, a heavy cruiser, was one of the 4 ships, suffered the worst damage, and that picture of the Exeter arriving back in Devonport for major overhaul was very much acclaimed by the committee. Well, now I'm coming on to another artist, Eric Ravilious. Now, he was one of those 3 young artists who sadly lost his life. He was accepted as a full-time salaried artist by the committee in December 1939, and he was given the honorary rank of captain in the Royal Marines, and he was assigned to the Admiralty. In February 1940, he reported the Royal Naval Barracks at Chatham Dockyard, and while based there, he painted ships at dockside, barrage balloons at Sheerness, and other coastal defences. He played perhaps the largest part in recording life at sea during the war and making studies of submariners, coastal defence, convoys and aircraft carriers. And he took up the challenge with gusto, despite most naval activity being between 1940 and 42 being in freezing northern waters. On 24th of May 1940, Ravilious sailed to Norway aboard the destroyer HMS Highlander, which was escorting HMS Glorious, the aircraft carrier, and the force being sent to recapture Narvik. From the deck of Highlander, Ravilious painted scenes of HMS Glorious in action, like that one, depicting Hawker Hurricanes and Gloucester Gladiators landing on the deck of Glorious as part of the evacuation forces from Norway in June of that year. The following evening, Glorious was sadly sunk, together with her two escort destroyers, by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, with a very great loss of life. Well, Ravilious, of course, wasn't involved in that tragedy, and the next place I'm going to show you is Morning on the Tarmac. Quite a different scene. Ravilious had a particular fascination with walrus planes. He wrote, "I very much like drawing these queer flying machines. They're comic things with a strong personality." And he became itchy to move on to something new, and he was assigned to the Air Ministry in 1942. He asked to go to Iceland to record the Norwegian squadron of the RAF, and he flew to the RAF station Reykjavik. The day he arrived, a Lockheed Hudson aircraft had failed to return from a patrol. The next morning, 3 planes were dispatched at dawn to search for the missing plane, and Ravilious opted to join one of the crews in the search. The plane he was on also failed to return, and after 4 days of further searching, the RAF declared Ravilious and the 4-man crew lost in action. His body was never recovered, and he is commemorated on the Chatham Naval War Memorial. He'd been brought up and educated in Eastbourne. A large collection of his works are held at the Towner Art Gallery in Eastbourne, where they are exhibited from time to time. Paul Nash, Ravilious' former teacher at the Royal College of Art. He and his younger brother John had both served in the First World War, and I showed you one of John's pictures over the top in the First World War. Well, Paul was first an infantry officer when he suffered a broken hip by falling into a trench. That led him to being invalided out, but dogged persistence got him sent back to the front in 1917 as a war artist. By the time of the Second World War, he was suffering from chronic asthma. Despite this, when the committee approached him to work for the Air Ministry, he was keen to comply, and like Ravilious, he developed a zest for aircraft, seeing them as aerial creatures with personalities. He produced a series of watercolours of British bombers, Blenheims, Hamptons, Wellingtons and Whitleys, but unfortunately his style didn't go down well with the RAF member of the committee, Air Commodore Harold Peake, who expected to see accurate representations rather than semi-abstract. And so Paul Nash was transferred to work for the Ministry of Information instead. He was determined that his artwork should be put to use, always hoping it could boost the British morale, and with that in mind, he produced some of the most iconic images of the war artist scheme. Here's one of them. Totes Meer, that's the German for Dead Sea. It's Nash's famous image of an aircraft dump near Cowley in Oxfordshire, in which the wreckage of German planes appears as an undulating sea under an eerie silver moon. Nash considered it as symbolising the defeat of Germany's aerial invasion of England, when between August and October 1940, nearly 2,500 Nazi planes were destroyed. Well, although the aircraft dump at Cowley contained many British planes as well, Nash only depicted the German aircraft because he wanted to show the fate of the, as he said, hundreds and hundreds of flying creatures which invaded these shores. He used the German title for the picture as he wanted it to be included in a series of postcards of crashed German planes that he suggested should be dropped over the Reich as propaganda. And to that end, Nash even created a postcard of the painting with Hitler's head superimposed on the wrecked aircraft. Well, Kenneth Clark stated that he considered Totes Meer to be the best picture so far, and it's still considered among the most celebrated British paintings of World War II. Well, we come to Nash's next major work, and that was the Battle of Britain. Large canvas with a focus on fighter planes, swirling vapour trails, black plumes of smoke from a plummeting bomber. It's really as though Nash set out to paint the opposite of his previous picture, exchanging the graveyard for sky, darkness for light, stillness of death for a victory dance. Both paintings were greeted with much enthusiasm by the general public when they were exhibited soon after completion in the National Gallery. Kenneth Clark congratulated Nash on discovering what he termed a new form of allegorical painting. Now, you'll remember I said the RAF didn't share the enthusiasm for Paul Nash because of his semi-abstract style. And so, you see, the advisory committee wasn't without some controversy. Well, one Frank Wootton had volunteered for the RAF at the outbreak of war for aircrew duties, but his artistic skills were soon recognised, and he was chosen by the RAF quite independently of the Artists' Committee to record the Battle of Britain at Biggin Hill. Well, Wootton later applied to be an official war artist, but he was rejected by Kenneth Clark, who was said to be rather miffed at not being consulted when Wootton was chosen to record the Battle of Britain. And so Wootton became the RAF's own official artist, bypassing the War Artists' Committee. None other than Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, Commander-in-Chief Allied Air Forces for the 1944 Normandy landings, personally chose Wootton to cover the invasion, as you can see on this next slide. Frank Wootton has been called probably the finest aviation artist of all time for his depiction of the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain and beyond. And before I leave him, here's just one or more of his, an outstanding picture of the sinking of the Tirpitz. Many unsuccessful attacks have been made on the Tirpitz itself since 1940 by the RAF and the Royal Navy, and this was the final and successful attack by 32 Lancaster bombers using the Tall Boys earthquake bomb, which had been designed by Wallace Wallace of the Dam Busters fame. Frank Wootton was founder-president of the Guild of Aviation Artists, and among many honours, he was appointed OBE 1995 for services to the RAF. And despite being rejected as an official war artist, some of his paintings were eventually acquired by the Imperial War Museum. Well, I'm going to take you back again to Edward Ardisoni. Since his return from Dunkirk and the recording of London Blitzes, he'd been up through Sicily and Italy with the 8th Army, and now he was returning to France after D-Day. He was a sociable and outgoing character, and he had a knack for getting himself in the right place at the right time. He wrote, "When an invasion of Europe was obviously imminent, I asked to be present at the landing, and was told by public relations that I could only be put on shore 23 days after the event. And that I met some friends from the 50th Division, and they at once said, 'Come along with us.'" And so here we see him, at least we see the picture he drew of a landing craft infantry, on the 12th of June, 6 days after D-Day. And in his diary for that day, he wrote, "On deck at 6:15, make myself some cocoa in a self-heating tin, glorious morning and feel much better, weather brilliant as we approach the French coast. A multitude of craft in every direction of all shapes and kinds, from battleships to the oddest looking things afloat." Well, I guess the soldiers on board weren't exactly feeling as high-spirited as Ardisoni was, judging by the appearances. And I'm now going to show you on the next slide some of that multitude of craft he was referring to by another artist, Norman Wilkinson. Wilkinson had been employed on camouflage in the First World War, and he was actually the inventor of dazzle camouflage for warships. In the Second World War, he travelled extensively to sketch and record the work of the Royal Navy, the Merchant Navy and Coastal Command. He witnessed naval actions such as the sinking of the Bismarck and D-Day landings from HMS Jervis, and he made 9 paintings of the landings. And here's one of his paintings. I think it lives up to Edward Ardisoni's description. You'll remember, as a multitude of craft in every direction of all shapes and kinds, from battleships to the oddest looking thing afloat. Well, the next artist I'm going to show you is Terence Cuneo. He had a very distinctive approach. He served as a sapper in the Royal Engineers for a short while, and then he became a war artist in Italy and France. I'm going to show the French ones first. The landing on Sword Beach. That's one of the 2 beaches that British forces landed on, and that's the landing by Terence Cuneo on Sword Beach. Sword Beach. I mentioned earlier that just 3 of the 400 official war artists didn't survive the war. One of those was Eric Ravilious. The other 2 were Thomas Hennell and Albert Richards. Thomas Hennell arrived in Normandy on the 16th of June, and he recorded with mixed emotions the battle and its impact on the French summer countryside. Drawings such as this one, aerial wreckage of V1 launch site. They were used by the War Artists Committee to publicise the destruction of the secret weapon bases. Hennell followed the action into the Netherlands before returning to Britain in early 45. His next assignment was with the Air Ministry in the Far East, but after heading out there he was captured by Indonesian nationalist fighters and sadly was presumed to have been killed shortly afterwards. Albert Richards was just 3 months into a scholarship at the Royal College when he was called up. He abandoned his scholarship and he joined the paratroops, and he became a commissioned officer. He was excited by parachuting, and he came up with some lively paintings of paratroops training. That's one of them. That was in fact a practice exercise for D-Day at Brize Norton in Oxfordshire. It was a brilliant action scene, wasn't it, of falling figures, gripping parachute straps, feet close together or in jackknife position. Well, just after midnight on the 6th of June, Richards himself was dropped near Merville to the east of Sword Beach with a unit of the 6th Airborne Division. There were so many casualties in his unit, he found himself the only surviving officer, so he took command until reinforcements arrived. Soon after this, the committee arranged for Richards to be released from the army to become a full-time war artist. And he followed the Allied armies closely through France, to Holland, towards Germany with the British Second Army. His work gives a truly frontline view, like this one, of crashed gliders. Gliders were sent over the Channel to transport troops and supplies to Normandy before and after the invasion. And here Richard shows the remains of the craft at Pegasus Bridge, which was one of the important bridges over the Caen Canal. Well, the following year, March 1945, Richard set off to paint a night attack. He was trying to find a shortcut, drove into a field, jeep ran over a landmine, and sadly he was killed. It's so ironic when you think of it, and tragic, that after being released from a fighting unit, which he took a very active part, to be an official war artist, just months away from the end of the war, that he should meet his death in that way. But I've concentrated on the Western Front in the short time available, Western Europe. But I must not ignore certain other theatres of war in which our war artists were active, the first one being Italy. You've already seen Terence Cuneo's work on D-Day. It was earlier in the war, while serving with the Royal Engineers, that he was posted to Italy. And while there, he received a commission from the committee to do some paintings, and I'm going to show you a very dramatic one. That is a Bailey Bridge, called the Amazon Bridge, over the Rapido, the River Rapido, which was in the Monte casino area. He was showing his interest as an engineer in Bailey bridges. That bridge was 80 foot long. It took just 12 hours to build, mostly under cover of darkness in May 1944. It holds a major significance because the crossing of that bridge allowed the Allies to break through the hitherto impenetrable Gustave line, which stretched from coast to coast in Italy, and its strong point, Monte Cassino, and that really turned the tide in the Italian campaign. Incidentally, that bridge was one of nearly 2,500 Bailey bridges which were built by the Royal Engineers during the Italian campaign. And this historic picture now hangs in the headquarters mess of the Royal Engineers at Chatham. After the war, Cuneo had the distinction of being official war artist to the Queen's coronation, and that was his picture of luncheon at the Guildhall. He also had a great interest in painting railways, and here's one that he did of Waterloo Station. That's how it looked 50 years ago, and he was honoured after his death by the sculptor Philip Jackson, who did that bronze, which I'm sure many of you would remember, which was at the when the Eurostar terminal was at Waterloo. Background says, well, that terminal had just been shut because its background said, definitely not business as usual. So that picture, that sculpture was done by the very well-known artist Philip Jackson. It has actually been handed over to the Royal Engineers Institution, and it now also fittily resides in the barracks of the Royal Engineers at Chatham. Well, I can't end this story without a mention of the forgotten war in the Far East, and who better to provide illustrations than Ronald Searle. Died as recently as 2011 at the age of 91, and of course he's best remembered for his Trinians paintings. Prudence is new to St. Trison's. I want you to take care of her girls. That was Ronald Searle. Well, to show you what happened in the war, he joined the Territorial Army in the Royal Engineers in 1939 as an architectural draftsman, and his brigade were en route to the Far East in 1941, and soon after arrival in Singapore, they were taken prisoner by the invading Japanese and set to work on the Thai-Burma railway construction. Here's one of his many illustrations, prisoners cutting into the mountain. And another one, prisoners working on a cutting. It's actually just inscribed there by Ronald Searle, prisoners working on a cutting. He was later transferred to Changi Jail in Singapore. And here's one that he did in Changi Jail. The inscription reads, Ronald Searle made this drawing under the eyes of the Japanese guards and buried it with others to avoid confiscation. Well, he managed to hide all his drawings, and when the Japanese finally withdrew and he returned to the UK, he took with him all those 350 drawings that he made during his 3 years in captivity. Well, at least one of them was left behind because it's on display in the Changi Museum. And he presented most of the others to the Imperial War Museum in 1984. So unlike the other artists that I've described, he was really a self-appointed war artist, and I'm sure Kenneth Clark would not have begrudged his efforts one bit. Just to show that Searle hadn't lost his sense of humour while in captivity, here's one of his cartoons. Copies of most of his drawings appear in the book To Acquire and Back War Drawings by Ronald Searle. The graffiti of a condemned man intending to leave a rough witness of his passing through, but who found himself, to his surprise and delight, among the reprieved. He was later to serve as an official artist, like Laura Knight, at the Nuremberg trials. Well, what of the end of the war in Europe? It's not surprising that there are very few examples of war artists' paintings to illustrate the VE celebrations. After all, their jobs were war artists, and we were now at peace in Europe, and I'm sure that, like the rest of the population at the time, the artists were probably celebrating and living it up. But one of the few official paintings was by Lowry, seated here, as you see. After the outbreak of war, Lowry served as a volunteer fire watcher, and he became an official war artist in 1943, and here he is contributing to the VE Day celebrations up north. In that painting, thousands of matchstick people are seen thronging through the streets to celebrate the end of World War II in Europe, the grim industrial buildings enlivened by flags and bunting, and there are even some people sitting on the rooftops. Lowry, by the way, rejected 5 honours during his lifetime, including knighthood in 1968, and consequently holds the record for the most rejected British honours. He did, however, accept the freedom of Salford, and he was elected a Royal Academician. Well, by the end of the Second World War, the committee had commissioned or acquired more than 5,000 works of art by a total of 400 artists. Of these 400 artists, about 40 were given full-time salaries, earning between £650 and £800 per year. Most of the artists I've dealt with today came in that category. Then there were about 100 others on short-term contracts. Most of these were on the home front, such as Henry Moore, Stanley Spencer, Laura Knight and Lowry. And the balance of 260 was made up of professional and amateur artists whose work came to the notice of the committee, and they decided to purchase them for the nation. The collection contributed to numerous exhibitions in London and the cities across the UK and abroad. The first one opened in June 1940 at where else than the National Gallery, the obvious ideal venue, with Kenneth Clark as its director. The gallery's permanent collection of old masters had been evacuated to Wales to some disused slate mines in Blaenau Festiniog. So a section of the National Gallery was ideally available for a changing display of these artworks continuously right throughout the war. Apart from that, selections of the works were sent on tours of galleries in towns and cities across the UK. Substantial number of paintings were sent abroad for exhibitions in the USA, Canada, Mexico, South America, West Indies, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. And the most successful exhibition in both political and cultural terms was the Britain at War exhibition, which I've already mentioned. That opened in New York in May 1941 and toured America continuously. Bear in mind that in 1941, the pictures would have depicted those scenes mainly from the Blitz, Dunkirk, and Battle of Britain, when we as a country were fighting a lone battle of survival. And it has been claimed that the Britain of War exhibition played a modest yet significant part in swinging American opinion in favour of entering the war. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've only been able to give you a glimpse into a few of the huge number of war artists and their works. Today, most of the works are kept in the Imperial War Museum, where they have major exhibitions from time to time. Others are in our naval and RAF museums, as well as galleries across the Commonwealth. And so I think you'll agree with me that we should pay tribute to the spirit and courage of those brilliant war artists who've left us with such a widespread and lasting legacy. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen.